welcome to another episode of the Middle East News Hour. I'm joined this week by two very important guests, both of whom have been guests on this program before, and I thought that two is better than one, and so I would have them both. We're having two doctors, Dr. Stephen Bryen and Dr. David Wurmser, to join me here. So first of all, let's just let you see them. So here they are, Stephen Bryen and David Wurmser. Thanks for both of you for joining me today.
Glad to be
Thanks
with
for
you.
having us.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. I'm just trying to find my WhatsApp so that I can turn it off and it'll stop ringing. So anyway, obviously there's a war going on between Russia and Ukraine. And this war is much bigger than Russia and Ukraine, but there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on the ground. There's a lot going on in the international diplomatic arena and in the international financial arena and in all other arenas. And I think it's important to understand this conflict that's going on in Ukraine in a strategic strategic framework. So I thought first we should really talk about it in the local framework and then stretch out from there to the US-NATO versus Russia framework, and then on to a larger framework with China involved, and finally what it all means for Israel and for the Middle East. So just to kind of introduce it, I saw we're taping this program on Monday evening Israel time, so Monday afternoon Washington time, and I saw a couple of hours ago that Ukrainian Prime Minister Zelensky just formally requested to join the European Union. And if you all recall, in 2014, before the Maidan Revolution, so-called, that ousted a pro-Russian president in Ukraine, the EU had offered Ukraine an economic deal that Russia claimed threatened it, and they didn't want the Ukraine to join. So in a way, we're going full circle back to 2014, as I see it, and we're doing it in the middle of a Russian invasion. So if we take the Ukraine announcement that they want to join the EU and that they had formally requested as a starting off base to understand the first of all, political dimensions or the strategic dimensions on the local Russian-Ukraine EU front, how are we supposed to see what's going on? Let's start with you, Stephen.
Well, the EU is not a military arrangement; it's an economic one
And a political one.
And a political one. Well, political to a certain extent. Yeah, I was kind of surprised Zelensky raised that, but I think he's frustrated with NATO and with the EU and the whole thing because he's been made a lot of promises since 2014. He and his predecessors have been made a lot of promises from Europe and the United States, none of which have been especially realized. And now he's in a war. And they don't have his back. I think he expected that the Europeans and the United States would have his back and would protect Ukraine, which they have not done as a practical matter. So he's trying his best. I think that's a fair way to put it, in a very difficult moment.
So you think that he's trying to force their hand? Do you think that he's saying, okay, ante up? Is that what he's doing? Or do you think, I had assumed that this was a move that was coordinated with Brussels. You don't think that that's the case?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether it was coordinated or not. He didn't, Brussels could have done this on its own since they have an application pending. It's been a pending. And of course, the reason it wasn't accepted officially was that they hadn't met all the criteria for cleaning up corruption in the Ukraine and problems like that, banking problems and whatnot. So they hadn't qualified yet. So that was the reason to hold them out, presumably. And I say presumably because, NATO has said similarly, Ukraine has to join NATO. We want Ukraine in NATO, but that was in as early as 2018. They passed a resolution. Georgia and Ukraine should join NATO, but it hasn't happened, obviously. And, I think that everyone in Europe is playing games, to be honest.
Well, Putin doesn't seem to be playing any games. What do you think?
Not now.
No, I don't know if he was ever, but how do you assess Putin, David? What do you think he's up to? Why did he invade Ukraine? I mean, I'll put it more precisely. I was very surprised personally by the invasion because I thought that the minute that Biden said that the United States and NATO weren't going to defend Ukraine, that Ukraine, to all intents and purposes, had just been handed to Russia because Russia is more powerful than Ukraine, and the West just left it without any defense and said we're not doing anything to defend it, so that it sort of just by natural progression, Ukraine fell back into Russia's sphere of influence, and so I thought that that was enough, and that Putin would say, "Okay, fine," and take it and pocket his winnings from having deployed 150 odd thousand troops to the Ukrainian border, and say, "I won."
Yeah, I think if you go back a month or two, that's exactly what I think was expected. I don't believe that the West actually had any intention of truly standing up for Ukraine. And I think the proof is in what happened early on. The first days after the invasion, the response was quite frankly anemic, if even that's a gracious way to describe it. We imposed sanctions that were meaningless. We didn't give any aid and made it very clear we weren't going to give any aid to Ukraine. We weren't even. I mean, it was very clear we were writing its eulogy on the eve of war. And if you go back a few weeks earlier than that, it seems as if we had entered a crisis that we thought might have been useful for our own purposes or whatever. But in the end, the Ukraine wasn't really on our minds to defend or to really integrate into NATO or the EU. What's so surprising is a lesson that we never seem to learn, which is listen to what your opponents are saying. Vladimir Putin has for quite a while developed his civilizational concept and made it very clear what his aims are. So the question isn't what he intended to do. This is something the West, I believe, just completely ignored and once again thought, well, if they want to say that they want to take over the world or if they want to kill all the Jews, that's just not really, nobody really does such things. So, we don't really believe that that's more than just a rhetorical flair. And then lo and behold, what we're seeing with Putin is no, that's what he meant. Now, what was the difference between what he meant and what's happening is a question of measuring up Western will.
Oh, Dave, you just went mute. Can you go back again?
Yeah, I think what you're seeing is the gap between what kept Putin from doing what he did and what he was looking to. He
You
measured us up. He measured us up in 2020. He saw the riots in our streets. Frankly, all over, we essentially began to understand and see that the West was crumbling, and he wasn't altogether wrong what he was saying. So I think that
Plus Afghanistan.
plus Afghanistan, and then there's also previous examples of Russian aggressions, whether it was Crimea or so forth. So I think he measured us up, and I think he felt that we had no will to stand. And again, looking at the first days of this crisis, it was wrong. I think the dynamics have kicked in that nobody expected.
I think you're right, but I mean, it goes though. I mean, you could say that the straw that broke the camel's back was when Biden said, "Well, if he just goes in a little, we're not going to have a problem with that," and basically just invited to invade, that moment. But on the other hand, I mean, I would assume
Change.
that he knew his capabilities, and so far on the ground, those capabilities aren't amounting to the shock and awe that we expected from the Russians. And I think it would be great if Stephen, you could also speak to that. But I mean, the minute that the United States, again, I just keep going back to it, the minute that America and NATO said we're not going to defend Ukraine, he didn't have to prove whether his forces could actually fight or not. He could just pocket his winnings and send the forces home and have a renegotiation based on the Minsk agreement that essentially gave him those provinces Eastern Ukraine and be done with it. And here he is. So, I mean, where do you take it from there, Stephen?
Well, you've said a lot of things there.
Well, you can do whatever you want.
I mean, one is a kind of Chamberlain, but without a letter. Biden, I'm talking about. So he hasn't even got a letter. Wouldn't even bother to send him one.
He couldn't even read it from his teleprompter
Well,
without
that's a
slurring his
different
words.
problem. But I won't address that.
Okay.
I think there's also a NATO complication here. I mean, because basically this specter of NATO is weak. I mean, let's be honest. It's far below what it was in 1991, for example, before the breakup with the Soviet Union, like about 25% of that size in terms of military capability. Very weak. But that's not what worries Putin. I mean, if you listen, as David said, if you listen to what they say and pay attention to what Putin and others and Lavrov and others in Russia are saying, they're worried about nuclear weapons on their border. And whether it's in Poland or Romania, or whether it's in Ukraine with NATO bases, which they don't want. So part of this problem is not just the Donbass basin and the two republics and the Minsk agreements, which are very narrowly focused. But part of the problem is this whole NATO thing, which has taken on monstrous proportions in Putin's mind, and in the mind of the Russian security establishment, who find this a challenge that they can't walk away from. And I think that, if we had paid attention to that properly, they've sent us, their demands, and they've sent us letters, and we've given them very weak responses, very incomplete responses. We haven't addressed these big issues. And then you have, on top of that, because this is like a pot boiling, you have this crazy man who's heading NATO making outrageous statements, which he can't back up, but the Russians don't know that. So, and he's demanding that Ukraine come into NATO, and NATO can do anything it wants. And, well, the Russians see that as a threat. So, I mean, I'm not justifying his invasion of Ukraine. It's awful, and it's horrible, and it's unnecessary, and he shouldn't have done it, and all that. But I mean, I can understand that the Russians are starting to go crazy from this. You can see it, and Putin's not very rational right now. You can see it in how he's talking. It's all mishmash because they're really under huge tension. I think that for a Russian leader, and Putin's a very strong Russian leader, at least he has been up to now, that there's always this threat underneath of the Russian nationalists and the threat of the army saying, we had enough of you, guy. We think there's a real problem here. We're not going to put up with it anymore. Out of the way. You're gone. And I think that coup threat, or whatever you want to call it, upheaval threat in Russia is a real thing. So that was the dynamic. And then you add to that Zelensky defending his country. He's a very brave man. He's an incredibly brave man. But defending his country, wasn't giving on anything. Not going to negotiate under Minsk. Sorry, not doing it. Even though he's a signatory, his country's a signatory, not negotiating. Not giving up on NATO. We need to have NATO. And I think he was promised things that were never delivered. I think that's part of the issue here. So it's existentially a mess, because you have these kinds of tensions which are hard to, it's not enough just for some peace talks on the, across the border in Belarus between the Ukrainians and the Russians. Maybe that'll slow things down in conflict. I don't know. But really, NATO, or the United States especially, has to address directly with the Russians these issues. And I don't mean by sanctions, I mean by negotiation.
So you think, and I do want you to get to Russia's performance as well on the ground, but you think that when Biden said to him, if you invade a bit, we won't care, that didn't register with him? He was thinking about what he was not, he didn't hear that. He didn't hear that the United States essentially just blew off Ukraine and everything that had been promised and sort of dangled above the Kiev's head and seduced into believing.
The Russians don't believe, right now, the Russians don't believe anything we said. Zero. I mean, Putin's saying it out loud. They're liars. They cheated us. They promised us no NATO in Eastern Europe, but they put it there. They promised us no NATO in our southern, Georgia and Ukraine, but they put it there. They promise all these things, but they don't do. They promised arms control, but they unilaterally canceled the INF. They unilaterally put M41 launchers in Poland and Romania, which could launch nuclear-equipped tomahawks. This is stuff that, from a Russian point of view, are all threats. And so they don't believe anything we say.
David, our friend, all three of our friend, David Goldman wrote an article, I think today actually came out in Asia Times, where he was he was documenting, how Putin started off his career as somebody who said that he wanted to join NATO, and was insulted and brushed off by Clinton, and then the United States and NATO went after Serbia and sided with the KLA, which was essentially a terrorist criminal syndicate that was run by Muslims with ties to all kinds of jihadist actors, to take over Kosovo and ethnically cleanse it of its majority Serb population, and just going on from there, and how he essentially blamed the United States and NATO for transforming Putin into somebody who wanted to join the West, and saw Russia as a European state into somebody who rejects the West and is pushing him and Russia into the arms of China, which we'll get to. I want to get to the Russia-China thing later, but he was really blaming the West. And, I think others like David Satter and other Russia, Russia scholars would look at this and say that, Putin actually has this sense that he's the czar. He's got no respect for human life. From an internal Russian perspective, that he rose in power by carrying out a bombing of apartment buildings to justify the Second Chechen War, and blaming it on the Chechens. And and then I saw the Russia historian Stephen Kotkin gave this Hudson Institute podcast, where he was essentially saying that Russia wants to be a great power. It sees itself as a great power. Putin sees Russia as a great power, and he wants to be that. So, all of these things are sort of pointing on it's a question of who is responsible for it. Is it like David Goldman said, it's very much the West's fault? Is it something just intrinsic to being a Russian leader that he wants an empire? So it was unavoidable. And where do you see it?
Well, I'm not sure it's all contradictory, and let me explain. When you go back to 1991, 92, America was the winner. There was a clear sense in the world. I felt it as a Middle East, somebody who follows the Middle East. You sensed very much an American era. And there was a sense of that even in Russia to some extent. And I think Putin thought that at the beginning that his avenue for resurrection lay through a Western framework. So he would ask for NATO and things like that. But the problem is that I think he fairly quickly, and over time, much more so, and recently with an intense acceleration, began to disdain the West. The more that he saw us, the more that he was part of us, or the more that he was exposed to us, the less his respect for the West grew. And again, I think that there's a cost to what's happening in the West. When we sit there and we burn our cities and loot and allow lawlessness, and we tear down our statues, and here's a man who comes from a culture which has a strong identity. And we signaled that the West has no identity, that we're weak. So we're asking him to become part of a structure that he identified as empty, as hollow. So the more he became familiar with us, the more he began to look elsewhere for a Russian future. And he looked into his own past. And he developed, along with a number of other intellectuals like Dugin and so forth, this Eurasian concept and this You saw it already in the Sochi Olympics with the opening ceremony, where he was basically making the point that no, we are not only a European culture, but we are a great European culture. And then you read articles by his intellectuals 5, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, already saying, look at this Europe. They have no Christianity. They have no West. The West is empty. And I think he began to disdain the liberal element of Christendom. He thought it's a corruption of Christianity. And so what emerged out of this, in many ways, in not altogether dissimilar from the Islamist critique of the United States and the
It's
West.
exactly what I was going to say. You're reminding
Yeah,
me of Melanie
a real
Phillips.
disdain. And I think we have to ask ourselves, why do students from abroad who come here go back so anti-American? And why do foreign leaders, the more they're exposed to us, hate us? And it's not because we're repulsive people. I think it's because from their framework, from where they come from, which are cultures which have strong senses of identity, we're empty. We're not offering anything. And they look at us and they think, why are we weak in front of these people? Why are
You got muted again. You turned off your microphone.
no, sorry. So their perspective is they look at us and they say, why are we weak? Why are these? We're not weak. These people are weak. Why did we give up? Why did we lose the Cold War? Why don't? And all of a sudden they begin to realize not only shouldn't they have given up, but moreover that they actually are a solution to the West's malaise.
It's funny. It was one of the things that I've been thinking about this week. Israel's progressive government now is led by Yair Lapid, the foreign minister, who from the first day in office, he's been waging war against Poland and Hungary, right? And these were allies in the EU that former Prime Minister Netanyahu had very assiduously cultivated relations with, because they oppose Brussels' knee-jerk anti-Israel positions and their globalist positions, and their whole concept that there's one way of doing things their way, and if you don't agree, if you're not a post-nationalist, especially if you happen to be Jewish, then you're bad. And so I was thinking how funny it is. Israel very unceremoniously returned its ambassador to Poland yesterday because it moved its embassy from Kiev to Poland after first moving it to Lvov. And Poland and Hungary are allowing in anybody who's running away from Ukraine. And Poland is the main place that people are running to. And they're really, sort of heroes in this. And here is Israel with its tail between its leg after it's been attacking and reviling the Poles. Not that I'm upholding them as paragons of morality or philo-Semitism, but they're actually standing up. And I thought how ironic it was that actually their critiques of Brussels are similar to Putin's critiques of the West.
Well, of course, that's what's angering Putin so much, is here he sees in Zelensky and he sees in the leaders in other places in Eastern Europe, people who still have a sense of identity, and that stands in his way. So he has a particular animus to them.
But he should like them, right? Because they actually stand for something.
Yep.
Wait, you're back off.
Sorry. They're in his way to deal with the West.
So they're protecting the West from him. Is that what you're saying?
They're in the way. They're in the way. And in his worldview, if they realized what's good for them, they'd realize, not in a thuggish way. I mean, yes, in a thuggish way, but he's basically saying, you guys think that you have identity, but you have, your identity is on thin ice as long as you attach yourself to the West, because that's a slope to nowhere. So your true interest lies rejoining us, your rising Eurasian Slavic power. So he sees them as having identity, but an unsustainable identity. If they want to join the West, if they want to join Russia, their identity is sustainable.
What do you think of this, Stephen? And also, if you can just move for a second as well. I like this discussion, but I do want to talk a little bit about Russia's battlefield performance, which is at least again, we're taping on Monday. It leaves a lot to be desired. And I find that stunning and very surprising. So, um, I mean, they only attack next door. This is not a major power projection challenge. They've been there for months. You'd think that they might have thought ahead of time that they'd need to refuel their tanks after a couple miles. But, you
Uh,
know,
yeah, the Russians have had a pattern of starting off badly. They started off badly in Chechnya. They made a mess, and they had to go back and with brute force fix. It started off badly in World War II. They were practically overrun.
yeah, but they were invaded in
They
World
had-
War II.
yeah, but they were invaded, but they had a huge army on the front line. Millions of men, 2.7 million soldiers sitting on the front line, and they got rolled. They didn't do well when they went into Georgia, into two provinces of Georgia. They lost a lot of soldiers, and they didn't perform well. And right now in Ukraine, they're not performing well. Did we lose Carolyn?
No, you didn't. I'm saying yes, but so what you're saying is you have to take a long view on Russia, that
Well,
they're
I mean, if
capable
they
of learning.
if they stay in it, if this continues, they will put enough force into. I mean, look, Ukraine can't hold out indefinitely. So then they put an awful lot of force already, but they missed on some things they should have known. I mean, for example, the Ukrainians are using the Turkish drones very effectively, the Bayraktar drones, which they used in Nagorno-Karabakh, combined with Israeli drones, to cause a lot of devastation to our Armenian-led forces, which used all modern Russian equipment. And the same thing is happening on a lesser level because they don't have so many drones in this Ukraine fight. So there's things they didn't learn. There's a lack of coordination of their forces. They've left themselves badly exposed as they come in columns, very easy to pick up and deal with. So it's not a great example of warcraft or military operation at all.
Are you surprised?
Not really.
Really?
Not at all. I originally thought they would just go into Donbass and Luhansk and stop. That they would, the peacekeeping mission that they announced, they would go in, they would fortify that place and tell the Ukrainians, if you want it, you come and get it. You're not going to get it. And that would have been really smart, but that didn't solve their NATO problem. That was the difficulty. And the NATO problem is bigger than Luhansk and Donetsk. It's just a tool from the Russian point of view. There are a lot of Russians in those places, but basically it was not what they planned to do, and they went after Kiev and Kharkiv. The big battle right now. I don't know when this will be broadcast, but there's a big battle going on in Kharkiv. And the Ukrainians are fighting them tooth and nail. So they're taking a lot of casualties. And I think the Ukrainians are hoping that the blowback inside of Russia will be enough to get the Russians to think more clearly about, how to get out of this mess.
What were you going to say about that, David?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there was a sense that Russians themselves may take matters into their own hands from Putin. Unfortunately, today you're seeing the Belarus also joined, and this can be a major problem for the Ukrainians because you have the far west. Belarus goes pretty far west there, and I don't know if the Ukrainians are really set up to defend that strongly all the way over toward near Lvov. The second thing is you are seeing some fairly significant number of Ukrainian cities now being surrounded. They're not capturing them, the Russians, but they're being surrounded.
What? Go back.
You're seeing a number of Ukrainian cities now surrounded. None have fallen, or not many have fallen, but now in this day there is an advance that's happening. I don't know why it's muting. Anyway, sorry about that. There is an advance today that you haven't seen that much in the last few days. The Ukrainians definitely are pulling out from the Far East, and they're beginning to try to concentrate their forces more toward the south of Kiev, southeast of Kiev, and more or less giving up some of those areas near Kharkiv and further east. So the dynamic is changing a bit today, and the Russians are changing their tactics. They're blowing up cities much more aggressively.
Yeah.
So this is going to have an effect. But that said, we're seeing serious deficiencies in the Russian military. And again, it reminds us that when we see these advanced weapons and so forth, the Russians have them. They're very dangerous, but they're not the same as our military, where when you take one unit and you take another unit, yeah, sorry about that. When you take one unit and then another unit, they're fairly comparable in terms of their capabilities. Russian units, there's a great variation. So, you have some units with these really advanced weapons that we have to be scared of. But then you have other units that are really under equipped and underprepared, and we're seeing that effect.
Yeah,
You would have thought they would have put the better forces in, wouldn't you? But
Yeah,
a lot of them are conscripts that have no experience.
some of them aren't even Russians.
So,
So,
Chechens especially. A bunch of them got killed yesterday, so
yeah.
including their general.
I mean, in a way, you could argue that this actually makes sense, that you want to put in the expendable ones first to be cannon fodder, figure out what the lay of the land looks like, and then bring in your better soldiers to take advantage of the situation as it develops. I mean,
I don't agree. I'll tell you why. There's a limited time to this kind of exercise. Any war, modern war today, has a limited horizon in time. You have to move very fast. And I think that, probably 3 or 4 more days is about it before the pressure on Russia will become so great that they won't be able to. The Chinese are now, now the second time demanding the Russians stop it. So the Russians can't afford to put themselves in this too much longer. I think they have to start to just make a deal. If there's a deal to be made, they have to make a deal. And they're going to settle for a lot less than they might have hoped for.
Let's see, that brings us, I guess, to the question of the West, right? And what the West's evolving response is. As David said at the outset of our discussion, the initial announced sanctions by Biden were pathetic joke. And I'm still not quite clear how meaningful they are or what they do or don't do. But going to what you just said, Stephen, about having a limited window to carry out your operations in this environment. I mean, I guess I would quibble from an Israeli perspective. Our window of opportunity is generally about 10 minutes before they have a UN Security Council resolution condemning us. But I mean, so that I think that Russia has lots of time, but I guess it's all relative. But I mean, how is it?
Well, if
is
their
it
banks collapse and if the
right? That's what I was
currency
going to say.
collapses, what are they going to do?
Right. So that's the
Yeah.
question: is how effective are these measures? Do you consider them to be very serious, and are they indeed a reasonable response to Putin's military aggression? Because it's a real question. You got military aggression, and you have financial sanctions that aren't sanctioning energy, that aren't sanctioning Putin in a significant way. I mean, there's a question: is going after financial institutions a reasonable response to war on the ground?
Well, I'll try. I mean, I'm not an economist, so I'm probably the wrong person to ask that question.
Well, start, and then
It
we'll move
seems to
to the
me
other
that
non-economists.
if the banking system collapses in Russia, if the currency goes worthless, instead of 3,000 people protesting, it's going to be 300,000 people protesting, and the regime's going to be in big trouble. So I think they do have a timeline here. And to that degree, the sanctions put a time limit on the war, but they don't stop the war.
Um, yeah, I agree with what Steve just said, and he's got a very dangerous several weeks ahead of him with these sanctions that are. I mean, the West wasn't serious, but they've become much more serious in the last 2 days. I think the fact that the Swiss joined tells you a lot. This is the first time I think Switzerland's made a correct it's not made a correct decision. Sorry, Switzerland has not made a correct decision in decades, so I'm rather surprised. That said, Putin will find a workaround if he survives the short term, and that workaround is China. What you'll see is that a separate bank. What you'll see is a separate banking structure emerge via China, and that's a big problem. We did. I don't think Western elites are fully, even now, capable of understanding how serious this can get, and how much of a cost there's going to be for us as well. And one of those things is, first of all, China is a third player, and Russia can work through China, as I mentioned, to circumvent sanctions. The second thing is we haven't seen the costs to us yet, which the costs for Russia are fairly quick. You go to an ATM in Moscow, it doesn't work. Apple Pay doesn't work. Things are shutting down rapidly. Stock market is crashing, ruble is going down, et cetera, et cetera. But when you look at the West, we haven't felt the impact of our own sanctions yet. When we start realizing, for example, how much of percentage of food that goes to the Middle East, grain that goes to the Middle East or Africa, comes from this area. When we begin to realize that fertilizer, 40–50% of the West's fertilizer comes from Russia, and we already have a fertilizer shortage that's quadrupled the price in the West. These things are things that we're going to feel come May, June, July, when we harvest and so forth. So I don't think the West fully yet feels the impact of this. And I don't think the elites here, I think there's a certain, honestly, in my view, there's a certain amateurness that, oh, okay, you do this, we'll just slap down more sanctions. And they're not realizing we're playing chess like I used to play chess. I used to have these brilliant strategies, but the problem was the other side always checkmated me before I executed them. So, and I think this is what we're facing here with Russia. I'm not saying they're going to checkmate us and that they have the ultimate ability to stop us, but I don't think we fully understand they're playing chess also, and they're going to come back at us with a lot of things, and there are costs to what we're doing. And do we really have the will? Do our elites really have the will to carry this through?
Oh, can I stick my nose in, David?
Yeah.
I mean, what you're saying is really important. But I think the other part of it is that Washington doesn't have a strategy, period. Right. I mean, this whole, and it goes beyond this administration to the last three administrations, at least. They have simply not paid attention to what Russia's strategic and security needs are, to how we're going to maintain the balance of power in Europe. I mean, these are things that we've just sort of pushed away, not dealt with.
Yeah, I hate to say it, Libya was a real watershed. We basically just blew off the Russians. And we promised them that this was a limited humanitarian operation to save a crisis in a city about to fall. And instead, we went straight for the jugular to bring down Gaddafi. Now, I have no love for Gaddafi. I was one of those in government in 2001, 2, and 3 who were bitterly opposed to any deal with Gaddafi and so forth. The fact was we signed a deal with Gaddafi, and he gave up his nuclear program and his aspirations. And we had our signature on that, and the Russians trusted that, and the Libyans trusted that. And we went back on it, and we destroyed Gaddafi. Am I defending him? No. But if you're a Russian and you're looking at this, I think the belief in Putin's mind that we are worse than we're liars, essentially.
What he
Uh,
says.
I think Libya was a major milestone in this evolution.
I think there were a lot of milestones. I mean, I think you can also go to Serbia and what happened with the NATO bombing there in the 1990s. But I think, I was just going back to look at the Times of Asia article while you were talking about the Chinese alternative to SWIFT. And so um, David Goldman wrote here, he wrote, this risks to this financial system cut both ways. The German Daily Die Welt wrote on February 27th, SIPS, that's the Chinese banking system or whatever, already handles $50 billion of daily transactions. That is considerably less than the 400 billion of transactions that pass every day through SWIFT, but SIPS volume has increased rapidly. If Russia and China linked their systems and offered an alternative to other authoritarian states, this could threaten American domination of financial markets. So, I mean, that's to the SWIFT thing, is that if you force Russia into China's arms because you're giving them no alternative but to abandon the Western financial system, then it will happen. I mean, you're not giving them any alternative, then they're going to take the only alternative that they have, which is China. And so I think all along you've been seeing this kind of very narcissistic American policy, if you can call it that, behavior towards Russia that always assumes that there's never going to be any consequence to America lying to Russia, to America going back on its commitments to Russia, to America taking financial action against Russia. I mean, just, there was a table up on Twitter yesterday that showed the percentage of gas imports for Europe, the percentage of the gas used by European states that comes from Russia, and it's enormous. So do you think that Bosnia Herzegovina, they get 100% of their gas from Russia, isn't going to suddenly get 100% of its gas from somebody else, or they're going to have no gas? No, but they'll pay in something else. They're going to be forced to do something outside of SWIFT because they have to pay for their gas. So, I mean, every action you take has a reaction, and it's true. I mean, in a sense, that when you talk about how this can paralyze Russia, well, it can also cause obviously an electoral nightmare for the Democrats, but beyond that, it can really cause enormous harm to the U.S. economy and to the EU's economy.
I think you're right about that. I mean, but the U.S. has a problem, with making promises it doesn't keep in lots of places. I have a list of names that I've been keeping. I'm going to write a piece about this.
You want to give us a coming attraction?
Well, it's a sort of room full of people who are disgruntled, and who's in there? So you have the Shah of Iran. You have Chiang Kai-shek, huh?
It's a big room.
It's a big room, and they're very unhappy people, and they're commiserating with each other.
Don't forget the South Vietnamese.
No, I have them in here too.
Okay, good.
Actually, I have Ziem first because he was murdered by somebody, we know who, and so that was one of. I have Venezuela. It was Juan Guaido was promised something that wasn't delivered. We have even Mubarak, if you remember, was promised something that he got the opposite, didn't he? And Gaddafi was one of my people in the room. And then we had Nguyen Van Minh, the last prime minister of South Vietnam, sold out by Paris Peace Accords, and so on. I mean, it goes on and on. But I mean, the problem is that, and then you have credibility issues with the United States, which wants to be the global leader, and it's falling from that
want to be a global leader, but I mean, it's also, there is an arrogance in our foreign policy establishment that grates people. I remember when I got into the State Department so many of our demarches, our messages to our allies and to our enemies always began with we it is in the interest of the international community and we believe it is in yours that, and then you can go on, whatever you put I don't know what, it can be big or small. The point was, it wasn't ours to speak in the name of the international community, and moreover, you don't tell a nation what its interests are.
I don't know. You're talking about, I
Well,
mean, there's something lovable about that as well. I mean, it's sort of like the World
no,
Series, I mean,
but
why the world, I mean, you have the American League for this is
well,
the
no,
National League.
but the proper American response, or the proper American demarche, should say it is in our vital interest that,
Okay.
or it is in our interest, and that essentially leaves the other side. Look, it's your choice. You want to confront us, you want to cross our interests. If you think it's that important, then try us. Maybe it isn't that important to us, or whatever. But there's this haughtiness that somehow we speak on behalf of something greater. And we do speak on behalf of freedom. I don't deny that, but we cannot. When you're talking to Russia, and at the same time you're letting your cities burn, and you express this sort of arrogant superiority, and at the same time you've got your cities burning and your statues being torn down, they look at you and they're like, these are not serious people.
You
And
know,
then you get the
But
gap
the biggest
between,
problem is that when we tell the Russians to give them assurances and then we don't keep the assurances.
yeah,
I mean, that is what Putin has gone chapter and verse on, hasn't he? And he said, well, you promised me NATO wouldn't be in Eastern Europe. And I was at this meeting and I was promised this and so forth and so on. And then they're in Eastern Europe. You promised me there'd be no nuclear weapons. And you put these M41 launchers in, which can launch nuclear weapons. Why? What are you doing? I mean, it goes on like that. You
yeah,
promised me you wouldn't go into Ukraine, but then you're in Ukraine. You said you would. The NATO things are for the future, but then you have NATO trainers coming in and NATO equipment coming in and all that. And well, we know there's going to be NATO bases in Ukraine with or without NATO membership. So this is really bothering the Russians.
I think it can be a combination of both. I mean, I think that, the United States is in a different place than it was when it was making demarches like that in the Reagan administration, or even the Carter administration, and beyond. Going back further, because Victor Davis Hanson wrote an article that I was planning on doing sort of a corollary to, where he was just talking about in the United States that the Democrats are saying that the Republicans are threatening democracy, and then he went through all of the things that the Democrats have done that have undermined American democratic processes, and going from mail-in voting, and radically changing the way that elections are done in the middle of a pandemic, and taking authoritarian action against people that they oppose, trying to bring down Trump with the Russia corruption hoax, and so on and so forth. And he gave this whole litany of things. And he said, no, he thinks that they're saying that democracy threatens democracy, that the fact that there's a very large majority of Americans who oppose Biden's politics and his policies, and that every single opinion poll is showing that the Republicans are set to take back control of both houses of Congress in November, that's really what they see as anti-democratic. So they're saying that democracy is anti-democratic. But I was thinking that the corollary to that is, you no longer believe in democracy, the people who are in charge in Washington. And I've made criticisms very similar regarding the government in Israel that just is based on a bunch of politicians who completely disregarded and betrayed their word to their own voters and formed the most radical government Israel has ever seen. And the EU, of course, I mean, every single time that they brought further integration and unified foreign policy to a vote, to referendums, they were brought down. And so they just ignored the referendum and they went forward. So you're looking at all of these kind of post-democratic governments, or transnational governments, governing authorities, and of course the UN, which is dominated by authoritarian governments. And you're saying that we speak in the name of freedom, we speak in the name of democracy, and you're coming to the likes of Putin or to anybody else and saying that, we're more moral than you are, we're better than you are. And it kind of undermines your message when they see what you're doing at home. But it also undermines the purpose of your foreign policy. I mean, what are you fighting for in Ukraine? You know, Ukraine also is not a democracy, right? The head of the opposition is in jail. You know, I mean, it's a wholly corrupt system. It's the most corrupt, government in Europe. So you look at all of these things and say, so what are you basing the moral calculus on, or the moral preening on, or however you want to call it? What are you fighting for? What do you want? Is it just raw power like it is at home? What are your ideals? What are you trying to gain here? You're just trying to humiliate Putin. Why do you want to humiliate Putin? Why do you want to defeat Putin specifically and not say Iran that you're empowering? How are you making your foreign policies? On the basis of what are you determining what your policies are? I mean, I think it just, you don't understand where anybody is coming from and what they want from you anymore.
Well, it's one thing I think that seemed to me is that it's more than Ukraine,
Mhm.
and that we're risking a general war, particularly in Eastern Europe, but beyond. And that means that the whole liberal democratic standard that we claim to support, and which European allies claim to support, is endangered. For what reason? Because there wasn't any reason. I mean, it was the arguments about this were not so much territorial as purely political. Well, we're going to put Ukraine in NATO. Why? And what happens if somebody doesn't like it and they're going to fight it? What's going to happen next? No thinking, zero thinking. And NATO was originally supposed to be a defensive system. That was its purpose, and should have probably gone away with the end of the Warsaw Pact, because honestly, it didn't have a role anymore in that sense. Russia was not an enemy on paper. But it hung in there. But then it expanded, and then it goes on and on from there. And now it wants to expand even more. So how is that supposed to be read by those who fear it, or by those who are afraid of it? It seems to me it was really terrible example of public policy making, not only in the United States but in Europe as well. I mean, they're as guilty.
You're talking about NATO expansion into
yeah. I mean, but if you're also talking about some of these people like Boris Johnson, his defense minister, who make absolutely outrageous and silly comments. And what are they talking about? They would like to have a war in Europe. They're prepared for it. But England has an army smaller than what they had at the American Revolution. I mean, it's not an army.
No.
Or
a navy.
I remember years ago sitting in a Foreign Relations Committee meeting with Henry Kissinger came in, and he was mad at the French who were giving him a hard time over Lebanon. He says, they don't have an army. There's no French army there. What are they talking about? They can't possibly do anything. And so they should just shut up. And he was right. I mean, he was absolutely right. If you don't have the ability to actually enforce what you say, be quiet. I don't get it. And I don't get this whole NATO thing.
That I think Putin understood, that there's a disconnect, that there's a strong disconnect between the Western image of itself and the Western language of determination, and the fact that we're not serious and we're not determined. How many times have you heard a Western leader say, this is unacceptable?
Yeah, but
This and this, yeah. That this move by some actor is unacceptable. We've heard this over and over and over again, and then we accept it. If you don't do anything about it, you've accepted it. So you have this rhetoric of toughness, and the liberal side on this country is much more, in terms of foreign policy, actually has a much tougher language. But then there's no follow through, and I think that's one of the things that Putin began to realize. It's all empty. There's no there. So So I think what happened was we started going down this road with Ukraine over the last half year. And we said things, and we just didn't have any idea that this is reality, that there are real people and real responses that may obtain, and that real people may go to war, and war is real. But this is a world, we have the same. I think I believe we have the same issue with Iran right now. We just don't take seriously what people say because we don't take seriously what we say. And I think
The
that's
difference is
a
that I
huge
think we
gap.
made promises to the Iranians. We probably made promises to them too, but we made promises to the Ukrainians. We don't really know what all those promises are. Something gave the Ukrainians confidence that they didn't have to negotiate, that they did, that they could stand up against the Russians without any consequence, because the West was going to bail them out. And the West is not bailing them out, frankly.
Well, look, it's clear that with all these
Bada 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 boo.
yeah, we did, all these withering sanctions that we heard about for weeks. When push came to shove, there was nothing there. There was no plan. We're scrambling to create sanctions. There was no, we thought toughness, that we thought that.
I mean, the thing though is that a lot of people have analogized this situation to World War One, that it was about crumbling empires, that it wasn't really clear, just because some archduke was killed in Serbia, who cares? Why did this generate? Why did this degenerate into a world war? What happened? And that really, I think, Stephen, you've talked about the dangers of this expanding, and I think that it's very true because, when you look at the gap between the rhetoric of the likes of Joe Biden and Tony Blinken and Boris Johnson and all the rest of them, and their actual capabilities or their determination to do anything about it, you see that they're making all of these commitments. They're making all of these public commitments to toughness, and this can have very very dangerous consequences, because there are people who still take them seriously, and there are people who really are concerned about them. Not everybody thinks that this is a joke, and just like the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Turkish, the Ottoman Empire were crumbling empires. They were sick men of Europe. So too, in many ways, I mean, NATO, like you said, it didn't really have a reason to exist after the Cold War, after the Warsaw Pact broke up, and it stayed on as this sort of weird military alliance among a bunch of people who don't have militaries anymore. And this can end up being the last gasp of a lot of organizations, of a lot of countries that don't understand why they exist anymore.
Well, the only reason it existed was so the U.S. would pick up the defense bill of Europe, and the Europeans could spend it on social services or whatever they wanted to spend, or getting rich. I mean, Trump was right about that for sure. But the fact of the matter is that the German army, the land army, and their air force too, is probably about 15 to 20% of what it was before 1991.
In Israel, I am this weekend. Major General Gershon Cohen wrote that Germany has 50 operational tanks in their army, and that the Russians have 20,000.
That's about right. And probably those 20 or 50 they have probably only work part-time. I mean, they
had 50 that were working. They have others that aren't, but there were 50 that were working.
Well, but they had 3,000 tanks before 1991, and they sold them off or trashed them, got rid of them, or sent them to parts of the world where they shouldn't be. But I mean, the Dutch did the same thing. I mean, they all did it, except the French didn't so much, because for their own reasons. But the Italians did. They all jumped off almost everything. So it's not a really Europe has no real capability without the United States. And we have about 50,000 people in Germany, in Italy, UK. But actually it translates into only about 5,000 or 6,000, maybe 8,000 at the most, combat troops. that can be deployed.
You
So
know, it
anyway,
reminds me of the Berlin tripwire, right? The Berlin tripwire was all about was entirely about the credibility of America's security guarantee of Germany, of West Germany. And that,
right.
yes, it's true, there are just, a very small number of troops in Berlin, but the purpose was that they were a tripwire that would be activated, and the US would come rolling in and cream the Soviets if they dared. And that was believed. And that's why Berlin was never unified under East German control, right? And now that's gone.
Oh yeah, that's gone. It's gone, been gone for a long time. But I
Yeah.
mean, the other point about that is that the thing that really kept the Russians back was the nuclear weapons.
Well, you still got them.
And then we put Pershing, you remember in the Reagan administration,
The
we
minute
put Pershing twos and the Russians put SS-20s and we put Pershing twos, and we're staring down, but that kind of held it safe. So the Russians weren't going to send the tanks through the Fulda Gap and attack Germany because, first of all, they would have to deal with the Germans. If you occupy Germany, you got to live with them. But in realistic terms, it just wasn't going to happen because the nuclear weapons would claim. And I think underlying this whole Ukraine thing is this nuclear weapons specter, which is, I wasn't so surprised that Putin raised the level of nuclear readiness on the Russian side, because I think they're damn afraid of nuclear weapons. And even though they have tons of them, they're afraid. And I'm not making excuses for it because it's another dangerous step and it doesn't help anything. But you can explain it that way. And I think we have to address that issue with the Russians. There's no other, the US and the Russians need to engage. You can't just throw spitballs over the transom. They have to engage. They have to get serious about nuclear arms control and forces deployed in Eastern Europe and in the Russian side, which are facing Eastern Europe. We have to decouple that somehow and create a peace zone in that area. And we're not, there's no movement like that. The Russians proposed it to us. They were open to it. And they were told, by Washington, forget about it. So I think, right now, when Putin said, I want security guarantees. So he was not being, I don't think that was an unreasonable request, frankly, at all. It could have
How
been
much
done.
do you guys think that the demonization of Russia as part of the demonization of Trump that's been going on since 2016 is playing into this? That because of domestic politics, that the United States painted itself, or at least Democrats have painted themselves into a corner where they're incapable of actually listening to anything that Putin is saying that is reasonable, that they can latch on to and make a deal about. Its reduction of nuclear forces or implementation of the Minsk agreements or anything else that you and you guys should check out. Stephen and his wife Shoshana Bryen co-authored an article, I think in the Asia Times, and so must also be on the Center for Security Policy website, where they talked about what would be an agenda for negotiations between the Russians and the Americans. But I mean, looking at how the Democrats have demonized Russia, do you think that there's any political capacity, any political ability on the part of Biden and his associates to actually conduct serious? I mean, put aside the question of competence, do you think that from a political perspective, they would find it feasible to actually make a significant effort on that?
I think that there was this considerable amount of unnecessary humiliation of Russia and unnecessary rising of tensions with Russia that had a political, that were fallout from our internal political debate. I couldn't understand why Hillary Clinton, starting with Hillary Clinton onward, they so clearly defined Russia as such an enemy at that point. And then at the same time, again, I don't think they ever thought there were consequences to that. So I think there was that. Then, and you go on, I think they started believing it themselves. So I don't think it's disingenuous for them to make these. I think they really have a reality problem. I see on the web now there really is this sense that all of the Republicans are simply agents for Putin. Even now, when every major Republican leader has essentially come out in support of Ukraine, they're still saying that the Republican Party is simply an agent of Putin. So there's a reality issue there. The second thing is, you saw, I think, one of the most dangerous acts of statecraft. The use of public humiliation. If you want to bring down a regime, then go ahead and use it, because your point is to humiliate the regime, weaken them, and then cause the internal problem.
Mhm.
But if you actually want to avoid a conflict and you publicly humiliate the other side, you've taken away the ladder from the tree to climb down. And what we did by this, oh, you will see, we're deterring Russia. We're going to make clear to Putin that he's not going to get away with it, and that he can't do this, and he's going to be so scared of us that he's not going to go into Ukraine. I think you almost left him no choice at that point, in the sense that if he had then been deterred, even if he had never intended to go into Ukraine. And again, I think his ideology suggests he had aspirations, but these aspirations are often dormant, or often not activated because the other side is strong. But once you humiliate him, once you sit there and you say, you're not acting because we deterred you, and it's a man like Putin who has to also internally survive on an image of being fairly tough, I think we left him almost no
Hung him out to
retreat.
dry, so we did.
Yeah. I mean, again, I'm not sure he wouldn't have done it anyway. There's all sorts of weird things he's doing right now that leave me a bit worried, like these tables that are, 50,000 feet long, and with his staff, there's something weird going on there. So I'm not sure where he is, but and all of this could have happened anyway without all that. But clearly, we set it up for him to be humiliated if he didn't invade, and yet that means we had a regime change strategy. That's what you have to read out of it. You don't humiliate somebody if you're not out to destroy him.
I agree 100%. There is also the Afghanistan problem for Biden,
Yeah.
who's holding the bag on that. So he's trying to overcompensate with being tough guy, but he's being tough guy with a wet noodle. So I mean, it's that kind of funny.
It's the worst combination. It's the worst combination
possible. Yeah. If you wanted to make the perfect brew, there it is.
Yeah. Well, no, go on. I wanted to move to the Middle East, but if you have a final thing you want to say, I don't want to interrupt you.
No, the only thing we sort of skipped over was China,
right,
a little bit, because the Chinese we would have expected them just to throw their lot in with the Russians, but they haven't. In fact, the Chinese have done two things. I think one is that they sort of went slow on the economic support thing, which was real interesting. They weren't in a big hurry to embrace the Russians on that, partly because they have their own economic issues inside China right now that are very severe. And secondly, they've twice now, as I said before, told the Russians, you've got to negotiate with the Ukrainians to settle this damn thing. They haven't said anything about the United States, but they've told the Russians to settle it. I think that's a powerful message coming from China, because China is the one ally the Russians have that really counts for something, big something, when it comes to the United States. So I don't know where that takes us, but I'm sure Putin heard it.
What do you think, David, about China?
Well, I think Steve's absolutely right. I also think there's probably a concern in China. China likes ambiguity, because so much of its strategy is to be part of us, and yet see itself in a twilight competition over systems, the communist system versus us. But at the same time, in a autarkic world where we live if we went to a Cold War structure where our economies were entirely disengaged, China has serious issues with that. They're not capable really of competing with us in that framework, in that strict Cold War framework. So they maintain a policy of ambiguity. And that ambiguity is to some extent relying on a lack of seriousness and a dreaminess, or a dawn we slept attitude in the West. And here comes Putin, and they're seeing what happened. You know, Sweden giving weapons and Germany giving weapons and people yelling at Biden that he's far too soft and so forth. And there must be a concern in Beijing on some level that perhaps Putin has awoken a giant. And that must concern them on some level because it complicates their reliance on ambiguity.
I agree.
I think you're right. I do think, though, that, again, these things go both ways. If there are implications for SWIFT for removing Russia, if there are implications for the U.S. economy or the European economy for placing sanctions, significant sanctions on a significant economy like Russia's, then there are even greater implications for the West if they were going to expand those to China as well. And I think that, China is Russia is being pushed into China's arms. I mean, is the other thing. If the West pushes Russia out, it doesn't have anywhere else to go. And the Chinese may just be seeing that Russia's market value is going down, and therefore they're playing hardball with them to lower the price of entry into China's arms. I mean, you can look at it in a lot of different ways, but I think the Chinese, as always, by being the Sphinx, are sitting in, are able to, take a lot from, gain a lot from this, much as the Iranians are just by sitting on the side and watching the price of oil go up. But
How
that
are the Europeans going to pay for natural gas?
exactly. I mean, that's
Where they're going to get it.
And where
Right.
they're going to get it? Well, he doesn't have to officially cut it off for political reasons, so you're not paying.
Nord Stream 1 is still flowing.
Oh yeah, no, he said very clearly, I've been reading the Russian press every day. He said very clearly, we're going to continue to fulfill our contracts. I think language is very important because when you fulfill your contracts, if the Europeans don't fulfill their end of the bargain, then he cuts them off because they can't pay, because there's no mechanism. And that's the end of the gas of Europe, and Europe is going to crash.
So let's just move for a second to the other, major beneficiary of this, which brings us to where I wanted to end, which is the Middle East, and that's Iran, right? I mean, Iran, just by the very fact that the price of oil and oil futures are going up very steeply, and all they have to do is just say, all right, fine, and they get all the sanctions that are still on them, even if they're not enforced, removed. And you see that Iran is doing very well at the same time that the Biden administration is saying that they're not going to increase U.S. energy output. Jen Psaki said this week that, if Iran agrees to the new nuclear deal, then the U.S. would be willing to consider Iran oil exports to Europe. So this is a major move by the Americans, and this is a major, and that these sanctions against Russia could end up just massively enriching Iran, even beyond what was to be expected with the nuclear deal. And looking at what's happening in Ukraine from Israel and also from the Gulf, you see that a lot of countries are hedging their bets and not wanting to side with either side too clearly. The Americans asked the UAE and the Saudis to support them in their support for Ukraine, and both of them abstained from doing so. And Israel, the government, has been massively criticized by the Likud for condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But also there's a larger question of how this thing can play out in the Middle East with Russia in Syria, and in alliance with Iran, and the United States also moving towards Iran. So let's start with you, David, on this round, which will probably be our last because we have gone over our hour.
Well, I think, whatever happens in Ukraine, Putin's not coming out of this with satisfaction. The assumption is he wanted the whole country. It's going to be difficult for him to take the whole country now. And this is a man who understands the power of perception of strength. And as a result, I think he's going to look now to reassert and rehabilitate his image of toughness and strength. Unfortunately, I think that uh, Israel's facing, I think it's reaching its red lines on both Hezbollah and Lebanon and with Iran. And so we're headed for some sort of a non-linear progression in either. And this is a place now where Russia, if before Ukraine they could have stomached some things, I don't think Russia's in a position now to allow its allies to be battered because it will look too bad coming off of Ukraine. So I think what you're seeing is a far more dangerous Russia and Syria and Iran for Israel than there was. And yet at the same time, the United States is abandoning Israel. I mean, let's be clear here. The United States is coordinating with Russia to help Iran when Israel sees that as a rapid and fast ramp to nuclear success for Iran. This is so Israel's facing a situation of increased isolation, promises that have been betrayed, and no expectation of defense. At the same time that they're facing a Russia that is much more likely to make a stand against Israel on behalf of their allies than they were 2 weeks ago.
Where do you take this, Stephen?
I was just thinking that if I were the Saudis or the UAE, I wouldn't be very happy either. I mean, it seems to me because they're fighting a very bad war in Yemen, where they're not doing very well, and probably have very little prospects of being other than holding the line. They can't do much more. It's because the Iranians keep feeding the missiles and the UAVs and everything else, the suicide drones and whatnot. And Russia's been playing with them, as you probably know, offering them S-400s and talking about new fighter planes for UAE, things of that sort, which I think would be fairly welcome from from their point of view because it would give them some protection. But beyond that, I'm not sure that a strengthened Iran with Russian backing becomes a very dangerous, as David says, essentially a very dangerous situation.
I mean,
nuclear or not nuclear weapons, it's a dangerous situation.
Mike Duran from the Hudson Institute is a big advocate for renewing as much as possible the former alliance between Turkey and Israel. And Israel, I think it would be crazy for Israel not to welcome that, but I don't think that it's entirely realistic when Erdogan is the head of Turkey. At any rate, Erdogan is wooing Israel. He's wooing the UAE and the Saudis. And President Herzog is going to Turkey on a state visit next week. And, when I look at the Abraham Accord, I mean, they were started, as best as I can tell, and actually Netanyahu said it in the Knesset today, and I was at an event with Ambassador Ron Dermer last night, and he said the same things there as well, which is that the Abraham Accords were born during the Obama administration because the Sunnis and the Israelis were all betrayed by Obama and looking for a way to survive his presidency. And the real question here is, with Iran really on the verge of independent military nuclear capability, being supported and backed by the United States, and the UAE, the Saudis being attacked by Iran's Houthi proxy, and the United States effectively supporting that by not putting them back on the terror list. Is there a way to survive this situation in the hopes that Congress in 2023 will be Republican and be able to restrain Biden, and then, God willing, a Republican takes over in 2025 and has a reverse of the Biden administration's policy towards Iran? Is there a way for Israel to again do some sort of a parrying thing with the UAE, the Saudis, and perhaps also the Turks, try to waylay the Iranians and disabuse the Russians of the idea that the best way to recompense their losses in Ukraine would be to go and back a war by Iran and its proxies in Lebanon and in the Gulf against Israel.
Well, I think, the UAE started this process not only because Obama dropped the ball so badly and was so bad, but that the Israelis showed that they weren't going to be deterred by that, and that they had the bravery essentially to go ahead and, even against their greatest ally, say, listen, the Jewish state was created because of a Zionist spirit, that Jews have to be masters of their own defense. And they'll go ahead and do whatever they have to do anyway, even if it means antagonizing your friend. And I think that the UAE bet on that. That made Israel a strong horse. So I think the rise, or not resurrection, but a reinvigoration of the UAE, Israel, Saudi, whatever alliance that emerges or that survives, really depends on the Israeli elites right now, security elites, and whether they truly understand that this is a moment where they cannot rely on the United States to defend it or to make the right decision even, and that they just need to act when they need to act and take whatever has to come. I think they will find, if they do that, first of all, America will support them, because acting is what Americans will respect. I mean, Zelensky a week ago, nobody cared about Ukraine, and nobody was going to do anything for Ukraine. The fact that they stood and fought has captured the imagination of Americans. And I think that's what made Israel so popular in America. And if Israel acts, they will get that. But if you have an elite in Israel, a security elite in Israel that thinks everything has to be done by permission, and that Israel isn't a truly sovereign state, and that ultimately its defense does rely only on the permission of the United States, it'll be worthless even to the UAE, and there won't be an alliance.
I think you're right. What do you think, Stephen?
I agree with that. I mean, I think it's absolutely correct. I've been involved in this stuff for 40 years or so, maybe a little bit longer. It seems like Israel can only count on itself. I believe that's always been true. It was true in '73. Certainly in that year, the U.S. did come in with supplies finally, but it took a long time, and Henry Kissinger was playing games, withholding supplies to try and broker some deal. I think Israel has to see its own security interests and execute them without any reluctance. I think that the Saudis and the UAE and others are pretty nervous right now about an emerging nuclear deal with Iran and what that's going to mean to them. It's going to put them under tremendous pressure. So I think the only country that's going to do anything to compensate for that is Israel. The U.S. isn't going to do anything.
Right. Right. And nobody will do it instead of Israel. I think and nobody will do it nobody will do it for Israel, I think, is really what it amounts to.
And you don't want to. Imagine if Ukraine a week ago, troops had been sent.
Right.
We might have avoided a war, but imagine Ukraine's image in the West. Why are we there? This is such a burden. And sooner or later, Putin would have then managed to do what he, through a coup or whatever, because the image of Ukraine would have been, this is not an American interest. Whereas a lot of Americans now are captured by what's going on. When you fight for your principles, people do respect you. And that's really the source of American support for Israel.
I agree. I think we have to end, since the news hour has now been going on for an hour and 17 minutes. But it's all about podcasts. Podcasts can be whatever they want. We still haven't gotten that network sponsor yet, but I'm sure that's coming around the bend. At any rate, I agree with you. Look, nothing breeds success. Nothing breeds success like success, and nothing breeds that initial success like the willingness and to go out and be successful. And I think that Israel knows that. Israelis know that. The question is whether our security elite, which is now in charge in this government of weaklings, whether they also get it. And Israel's very existence really depends on them understanding that. So we'll just have to wait and see and pray and hope that they do, because I think you're right. The lesson that we've gained a lot of lessons from what we're watching in Ukraine right now. We know that words have consequences, that commitments must be fulfilled. They shouldn't be made lightly. And we've learned that people who stand up for themselves are likely going to be in a better position than people who expect other people to stand up for them. So on that very profound and happy note, I want to thank you guys both, David Wurmser and Stephen Bryen, for joining me today. And all of you people, now I'm going to go to the speaker view so that I can be the authoritative one turning off the show for this week. But thank you all for watching. Subscribe, share, and so on and so forth. Obviously, these things are very important for us all to understand as we go forward into the world and try to make sense of a rapidly changing world. So thank you all. Thank you, Stevens. Thank you, David. And we'll see you again, all of you, next week. Take care.